I could be wrong, but I feel like something could be going on. The more I see you, the more that it becomes so true. There ain't no other for me, it's only you. I wanna be down, we should go. I wanna be down, I wanna be down. You know me better.
The neon lights of the bustling city reflected off the rain-soaked pavement, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the faces of hurrying pedestrians. JYUN, a young woman, caught in the swirl of the crowd, tucked into a dimly lit jazz club, seeking refuge from the relentless downpour. She hadn't planned to be out this late, but today had taken an unexpected turn. Her office had been a battlefield of tension. Inside, the mellow tunes of music danced through the air, waving around the low hum of conversation. JYUN's eyes scanned the room, searching for a quiet corner to drown her sorrows in a glass of drink. The bar wooden countertop gleamed under the warm light, and she slid onto a stool, her damp coat whispering against the leather. The bartender approached. "What can I get you?" JYUN replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. As she waited for her drink, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The way Mr. JYUN had pointed out her mistake in front of the entire conference room, his voice sharpened, had left her feeling exposed and incompetent. She prided herself on being meticulous, so this public was a new and unwelcomed experience. The bartender placed the glass off in front of her, and she took a grateful sip. The rich flavor offered a brief respite from the echoes of her boss's words. The club was filling up, the air thick with the scent of damp clothing and the faint hint of smoke. A hush fell over the room as the music began, creating a narrative that seemed to resonate with everyone present. JYUN closed her eyes, allowing the music to transport her to a place where she was appreciated and valued. But her moment of solace was interrupted by a presence beside her. She opened her eyes to find Mr. JYUN sliding onto the adjacent stool, his tie loosened and a hint of surprise in his eyes. JYUN hurried into the conference room, clutching her notes as she took her seat. The tension in the room was palpable, and it seemed to thicken as Mr. JYUN entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. His sharp, tailored suit was immaculate as always, but today there was an edge to his movements, a coldness in his eyes that made JYUN's stomach tighten with anxiety. As he walked to the head of the table, his gaze swept over the team, landing on JYUN with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly. She straightened her papers, trying to ignore the knot of nerves forming in her chest. "All right, let's get started," Mr. JYUN said. His voice clipped. "I've reviewed the reports of all submitted for the upcoming presentation to the board. Most of them are adequate, but there are a few glaring issues that need addressing." JYUN felt her heart skip a beat, praying her report wasn't one of those with issues. She'd spent hours on it, making sure every detail was perfect. But when Mr. John picked up a single sheet of paper from the stack in front of him, her heart sank. It was hers. "Miss Kim," he said, his voice with icy precision, "would you care to explain this?" He held up her report, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the page. Wine swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. I believe the report is accurate, sir. I checked the data thoroughly before submitting it." "Did you know?" His tone was sharp, and Wyan could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, the air in the room growing heavier with each passing second. "Then perhaps you can explain why there's a comma missing here," he continued, tapping the page. "And here." He tapped another line, the sound like a hammer striking her confidence. Wyan's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she glanced at the areas he pointed out. The mistakes were minor, almost insignificant. But the way he was emphasizing them made it feel as though she'd committed a grave error. I must have overlooked those," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry, Mr. John. I'll correct them immediately." "Sorry?" he repeated, his voice a low growl. "Miss Kim, do you think the board will accept sorry when they see this? Attention to detail is crucial, especially at this level. A single mistake could undermine the credibility of our entire presentation." Wyan's face burned with shame. She'd worked so hard to prove herself, to show that she belonged here, and now she was being dressed down in front of everyone for something as small as a missing comma. She clenched her hands in her lap, resisting the urge to argue, to defend herself. "Attention to detail is non-negotiable," he continued, his gaze boring into her. "I accept perfection, and anything less is unacceptable. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Mr. John," Wyan replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the weight of her colleagues' pitying stares, and it took everything in her not to shrink into her seat. He nodded curtly, dropping the report back onto the table. "See that it doesn't happen again." "Yes, sir." The meeting continued, but Wyan could hardly focus. Every word Mr. John spoke seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her of her failure. She barely noticed when the meeting ended, her thoughts too clouded by the sting of his words. As she gathered her things, she caught his eye one last time. His expression had softened slightly, as if he regretted of his tone, but he said nothing more as he left the room. Well, Miss Kim," he said, his voice low, almost atmosphere. "Fancy meeting you here." Wyan's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She couldn't believe her misfortune. Of all the places in the city, he had to be here. "Mr. Jun," she replied coolly, "what brings you to this part of city?" He leaned closer, his gaze intent. "The same thing that brings everyone to a place like this, I suspect. A desire to unwind." Wine couldn't help but wonder if he was looking for a crack in her armor, a sign of the inadequacy he'd exposed earlier. The tension between them grew as palpable as the baseline, and she found herself unable to look away from his piercing gaze. "I hope you don't mind if I join you," he continued, his voice dropping an octave. "I find it fascinating to observe the nightlife from the perspective of those who create it." Vine narrowed her eyes, taking another sip of her drink. "And what perspective is that?" "The perspective of someone who knows what it's like to crave a little chaos after a day of order and discipline," he said, his tone carrying a subtle challenge. She felt a strange building within her. "Chaos isn't something I crave," she replied, her voice steady, "but I do appreciate a good jazz solo." He chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "Fair enough," he conceded, signaling the bartender for a "Tell me, Miss Kim, what is it that you do crave?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was he flirting with her? The very idea seemed absurd, yet the way his eyes danced over her suggested something more than professional interest. Vine took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I crave respect," she said firmly, "and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of understanding." His smile grew, a hint of challenge still in his eyes. "Respect is earned," he said, his voice low and smooth. "But understanding, that's something I can offer." The air between them crackled with tension, a silent dance that seemed to mirror the rhythm of the music. Vine knew she should walk away, but she was drawn into the conversation, the lines between work and blurring. Mr. John's gaze remained fixed on her. "Understanding is a two-way street," he murmured. "Tell me, what did you really think of me?" Vine took another sip of her drink, considering her words carefully. "I think you're cold and demanding," she replied, "but also intriguing." His smile widened. "Intriguing, huh? And what makes you say that?" "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "There's more to you than just the CEO who expects perfection." Mr. John leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Perhaps you're not as predictable as I thought either." Vine felt a thrill run through her at his words. She knew she should be offended, but instead she was fascinated. He was right. She didn't crave chaos, but she did crave passion and connection, things that had been sorely lacking in her life lately. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, extending his hand. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, torn between the to feel alive and the fear of crossing a line she might not be able to uncross. But the movement was too potent to resist. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the dance floor. The music picked up again, a rhythm that seemed to wrap around them like a lover's embrace. He pulled her close, his hand firm at the small of her back. Wine felt the against hers, the beat of his heart matching the tempo of the song. They moved together effortlessly, as if they had danced 1,000 times before. With each step, the distance between them shrank, and the animosity of the day faded away, replaced by attention of a different kind. His hand, her back, sending a shiver through her. His eyes searched hers, and she saw something in them she hadn't seen before. As the song reached its crescendo, Mr. JYUN leaned in, his breath warm against her neck. "You know," he murmured, "you're more than just an employee to me." The word sent a shock wave through her, and she stumbled, the reality of the situation crashing down. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He held her at arm's length, his gaze intense. "I'm saying that I see thee in you, YN, and I want to know what happens when it's not just your work that it." YN's mind raced. Was this a proposition, a declaration, or just another game of power and control? Their eyes locked, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything. She took a deep breath. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. His smile was knowing, and he leaned in closer, his voice a murmur. "I think you do." The air grew thick with anticipation. YN's heart pounded in her, the of his breath on her, setting it alight. And then, without warning, met hers, that was fiery and full of unspoken passion. It was that spoke of a connection that had been simmering beneath the surface of their professional facade. Her responded instinctively, melting into him as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, was demanding yet gentle, the perfect blend of and care that sent a thrill through her. Her hands found their way to his, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. For a brief, dizzying moment, she forgot about the mistake, the tension at work, and the cold, unyielding man he'd been just hours ago. But as the music swelled and the applause of the audience broke through their bubble, reality crashed back in. She pulled away, her breath ragged and her thoughts racing. What had just happened? Was this a one-time slip or the beginning of something that could never be? Their eyes met again, and she saw the same bewilderment reflected in his gaze. They both knew the rules of the corporate world, and crossing the line between boss and employee was a. But as they stood there, still swaying to the rhythm of the music, it was clear that neither of them was quite ready to step back into the familiar dynamics of their office life. They had changed everything, and as the night grew darker, the unspoken promise of more filled the air between them, as potent as the club was alive with the vibe of possibility, and for the first time since he'd walked in, Mr. JYUN didn't seem so cold and untouchable. He took her hand, leading her back to their stools, his sending a thrill up her arm. "Let's talk," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Wyan nodded, her heart racing. As the club emptied and the music grew softer, Mr. Jun leaned in, his breath warm against her ear.
Perfect.
"Wyan," he said, his voice a whisper, "I think we've both had enough of the cold shoulder tonight." Her breath caught in her thought, and she turned to face him, her heart pounding in anticipation. "What are you saying?" He took her hand, his thumb brushing against her in a tender.
Perfect.
"I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, we could explore this chemistry outside the office." The proposal hung in the air, as delicate and explosive as a... She knew the risks, knew that it could ruin them both. But as she looked into his eyes, she also knew that she couldn't walk away from this, not now. "Okay," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Let's do it." The smile that spread across his face was one of pure victory, yet tinged with something softer, something she hadn't seen before. He leaned in, his, raising hers in a promise of what was to come. The club lights dimmed, signaling the end of the night. She realized that she was stepping into a dance that had no clear end, a dance fueled by passion and the thrill of the unknown. And as they stepped out into the cold night, hand in hand, she couldn't help but wonder if she just made the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she'd ever made. But there was no turning back now. They'd crossed the line, and there was no going back to the predictable rhythm of before.
얘는 네가 떠나도 I don't care about it all. 어제까지도 우리는 같이 있어도 이제는 네가 떠나도 I don't care about it all. 어젯밤과 함께 떠나갔던 안개는 나를 전혀 바라보지 않죠.